that the lifeboat can't be launched from Lynmouth. As a result, local men are dragging the lifeboat across the steepest hills in the West Country to Porlock, 14 miles away, where they should be able to put to sea.
It was one of the most remarkable rescue operations in the history of the lifeboat service, and today, exactly 100 years on, they've been reenacting it.
It was cold, windy and wet in Lynmouth early this morning, but that's exactly what it was 100 years ago today, when the coxswain of the Lynmouth lifeboat, Jack Crocombe, made a momentous decision.
There's a vessel in distress out there, the Porlock.
We launch from Porlock where?
He decided to take the Lynmouth lifeboat, the Louisa, on a 15-mile journey through the night to go to the aid of a cargo ship drifting in force 8 gales in the Bristol Channel. Using a boat borrowed from a museum on the Isle of Wight and a team of cart horses, 50 volunteers today reenacted that journey. Hundreds of people from the southwest and further afield put up with the poor conditions to watch the team pull out of Lynmouth.
It's wonderful. I think it's super. Yeah, it's worth coming out in this weather.
I think they would have been very pleased to think that, you know, their efforts had been rewarded by such a turnout. It's lovely, isn't it?
We've been talking about it for several days, and they're fascinated. We've been looking back, looking at old records and so on, and finding out lots about it. And I think we've all enjoyed finding out about it.
The reenactment kept closely to the original script, although for safety reasons, a tractor had to be used in places. A century ago, the horses and crew got to the top of Countersbury Hill, a 1 in 4 climb. But the weather was so bad that only the 13-man crew and the 7-man launching party continued through the night. The weather was nearly as bad on Exmoor today, as the reenactment team made their way towards Porlock. Unlike their predecessors, however, they did benefit from a brief respite from their exertions halfway to their destination.
Just keep going, basically. It's going to get hard as we get up to Colburn up there, because it's quite a hill coming up, and you've got to take the weight off the horses. But it's bad enough walking, but when you've got to pull a bit as well, it's quite hard.
They're about 2/3 of the way through now, and the weather's brightened up considerably. Very different from 100 years ago, when they set off across Exmoor, buffeted by gale-force winds all the way. Today's volunteers also benefited from modern roads. A century ago, the lifeboat crew at one point had to drag the Louisa on skids because there wasn't enough room between the houses for boat and carriage.
I think the people that are down here in Porlock, we're this afternoon to welcome us, is evidence of the commitment that the villagers put behind this celebration.
This marked the end of today's journey, but that wasn't the end for the crew of 1899. They then helped to escort the stricken cargo ship to South Wales, something today's volunteers would find it even more difficult to emulate.
And from Lynmouth in North Devon to Porlock in North Somerset, the crew and horses were reenacting a mission essential
to watch volunteers recreate the incident when storms meant Lynmouth lifeboat had to be dragged over land to Porlock so it could be launched to help stricken mariners in the Bristol Channel. The 14-mile marathon took 10 hours.
Scotland, Glenn Hoddle said he would...
One of the biggest storms on record roared across the Atlantic and raged up the Bristol Channel. Darkness was falling as the winds picked up. 2 miles offshore, a 3-masted ship was under tow when, battered by waves, the tow rope broke. Just some of the ingredients that led to one of the most heroic acts in maritime history.
And that's why today, exactly 100 years later, we're celebrating the now famous launch of the Lynmouth lifeboat. It was a truly extraordinary, epic adventure, because before the lifeboat could be put into the sea, it had to be dragged 13 miles over Exmoor.
The winding route from Lynmouth to Porlock skirts cliffs, crosses open moorland and climbs 2 1,400-foot hills. It took 10.5 hours in the dark, with the rain lashing down. So why did they have to do it?
This is the slipway they should have used at Lynmouth to launch the lifeboat. But that night, the storm was so severe and the wind had veered to the north, so waves were crashing over the harbour wall. And to attempt to launch the lifeboat here would have been foolhardy. It would have been swamped and smashed to bits. So they were stuck. And then, worst of all, they discovered that the telegraph lines over the moors had been blown down. They'd been told to rescue the sailors on board the ship, and now they had no way of telling anyone else that they were unable to do so.
The decision was made to take the lifeboat overland to Porlock, the only harbour where they could possibly launch safely. But the task was daunting. At the outset, they faced one of the steepest hills in the country, a gradient of 1 in 4. Some said it was impossible, but the entire community of Lynmouth turned out, women and children helping the crew and 15 horses to pull and push the boat up the hill. For this centenary reenactment, it was too dangerous to use horses on the slippery road, so they used a tractor.
Keep pulling now, we'll make it. Keep pushing, everybody! Help the horses! Jig on now, come on! Don't let them stop, for God's sake! If they horses stick on Conisbury Hill!
The whole lot'll go backwards all the way to Lynmouth, or sideways after Clef.
Either way we're gone is.
They'd made it to the top of the hill, but they weren't much better off. They're on one of the most exposed parts of Exmoor, 1,000 feet above sea level, and the storm was still raging.
There's really no words to describe it. It was dark. It was overnight. We're doing it in the daytime. They really didn't know what was going to be around the next corner, whether they were going to get through or not.
The long haul across Exmoor is made easier today by the fact there's now a proper road. 100 years ago, the route from Lynmouth to Porlock was little more than a rutted track. Many times that night they feared the 34-foot-long and 3.5-ton lifeboat would get stuck. At one point they took the vessel off its carriage and manhandled it on skids down a slope because the hairpin bends in the lane were too sharp.
This is a bloody hard road to Porlock, if you don't mind my saying so. The corners will be damn tricky. I mean, how can we get 20 horses and a lifeboat down a corkscrew?
They're chancy right enough.
Yeah.
But if he can stop boats slipping off her carriage, I'll get us round the buggers.
Right.
By God, man, it's something this.
And then they got to the bottom of Porlock Hill and they couldn't go any further. So they knocked on the side of a house, didn't they? And the old lady looked out of the house and said, "What's going on?" Early in the morning. But as soon as she knew what it was all right.
Well, the lifeboats finally arrived at Porlock and everyone's having a whale of a time. It was a very different story a century ago. Then it was 5 o'clock in the morning when the crew pushed the boat into town. They'd spent 10 hours during the night getting here. They'd had no food, no rest. And worst of all, they had no idea whether they'd arrived in time.
Well, I think really and truly the seas had gone down. They were pretty mountainous, but they'd gone down and they did launch and they put to sea and they got out to her, but I think she was assisted by another boat who'd come across from Barry at that time.
So really, I mean, the heroic achievement was actually getting the boat to here.
I think in the annals of the lifeboat history that they were credited with saving 15 lives, so that's pretty important, really.
It was the most amazing feat. I mean, just think of it, in the wet, and they didn't have the gear that we have today. They didn't have the waterproof clothing. It was hard. The track wasn't a metal road. It was really difficult, but they managed it.
Now, unfortunately, this isn't the original lifeboat, the Louisa. It's a replica that's been painted to look like it, although this boat was built at about the same time, 1887. The whereabouts of the original lifeboat, the Louisa, remains a bit of a mystery. No one's quite sure. They think it may have been turned into a houseboat. So, if you're living on it, or you know someone who is, then tell us, and we'll pass it along.
No one in the but
watch the trailer come round. Start straightening up.
There's my babies back there.